Please welcome to the stage Margaret Lowe, President of Atlantic Live.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. As you just heard, I'm Margaret Lowe. I'm president of Atlantic Live, and it's wonderful to see all of you here. Thank you for getting up so bright and early to be with us. I hope you had plenty of juice and coffee to help fuel your morning. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome you to this Atlantic Forum called At What Cost? I think it's probably an understatement to say that the future of healthcare is a heated topic here in Washington and across the country. Among the biggest issues, the cost of care. Americans spend more money on healthcare than any country in the world. And of course, one slice of that debate is the cost of prescription drugs. So today we're going to tackle some big questions on that front. How can the healthcare sector make medicines more affordable? And is it possible to foster innovation and contain costs? More broadly, why do we spend so much on every aspect of our care? Before we get rolling, I want to take a moment to thank our underwriter, Express Scripts, for making our conversation possible. We're so grateful for your support, Express Scripts. And a few notes before we get started. Please silence your cell phones, but don't put them away, because we would love you to join the conversation on Twitter. We're at Atlantic Live. It's one word, and the hashtag is AtlanticRxCost. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and to kick us off, I am so pleased to welcome Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar for a view from her perch on the Hill. She is here with the Atlantic's executive editor, Matt Thompson, and I'm looking for them. Matt, Senator? This is rare, but it's kind of amusing, isn't it? Matt Thompson and Senator Klobuchar, wherefore art thou? There they. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And thank you, Senator Klobuchar.
Well,
Thanks
you, Matt.
to all of you for joining us this morning. So,
It's pretty impressive at 7:30 in the
I
morning.
know. Excited to talk about pharmaceuticals and cost.
Yes.
So, I want to take you back. We were all so young and fresh-faced. It was last December. And multiple,
So much hope.
so much sunniness and optimism. It was another age.
That was before I was displaced by Melania Trump as the most famous Slovenian American. That time.
You were, at the time...
She was actually born an hour away from my relatives.
Wow.
As I said the other day, every time I look at her, it's like looking in the mirror. But so that is that time. I'm back there now.
I've said the same thing.
Okay.
You, at the time, last December, you called drug policy, drug pricing, one of the priorities of the year.
Yeah.
Fast forward to October 2017. How has that priority changed,
Okay.
if at all?
Well, I think it's become even more important when you look at the numbers and what's been happening. We're proud of the fact that pharmaceutical companies employ so many people in America, that they've made all these incredible, innovative discoveries, and that is all good. But at the same time, like any business, if a monopoly falls in their lap, they go for it. I'm the ranking on antitrust, and we've seen that across many other industries. It's not just one. So what has happened since that time? Well, things have only gotten worse. The numbers have gotten worse. You're going to hear today 870,000 Americans spend over $50,000 a year on their drugs. Think about that. In 2015, the U.S. spent an estimated $457 billion on prescription drugs, which is a 30% increase from 2009. And 1 out of 4 Americans either cut their drugs in half if they have pills, or they take less than they're supposed to, or the woman from Minnesota who saves her insulin injector every day for just the extra drops, because the prices of that basic drug of insulin have gone up 3 times in just the last few years. 4 of the top 10 selling drugs in America have gone up over 100% in just the last few years. So this is not just EpiPen, or it is not just insulin, or it's not just Shrek, how do you say his name again? Martin
Yeah, I'm
Shkreli. That was
uncertain of this,
who's
too.
this good person there? It's not just Martin Shkreli. I memorized it at Belly and then I forgot. Shkreli. It's not just him, right? One guy going to jail. No. It's a systematic issue across our American healthcare system. So it's gotten worse. And in terms of what's happened as a priority, one of the things I was heartened by was that the president, all through his campaign, had talked about allowing Medicare to negotiate prices. And I put it more simply that there's a ban in law that says that 41 million Americans, all seniors, can't negotiate better bargains, and they're pretty good at doing that, but they're not allowed to by law. They're banned. And so the president has said many times he supports lifting that ban, which of course kept in through the Affordable Care Act and debate and everything else. So this could be a real moment for him to seize this issue. And so we just haven't seen that yet. He hasn't backed away from his position, but he just hasn't done anything yet. So we would really like to see change there. And then as far as Congress itself, there was one memorable vote on the drugs from Canada, I picked up was my amendment with Senator Sanders, although it's almost identical to a bill that I have with Senator McCain. And we picked up like 14 Republicans. So I think there is movement. What my colleagues say, especially my Republican colleagues, behind closed doors is different than maybe what they say publicly, but they are all really concerned. Not all, that's not fair to say. I'd say 5 or 10 of them that I didn't expect to ever bring up this issue have brought up this issue to me. So I think there is some clear knowledge that this is a problem and that we need to do something about it. And for the American public, it is one of the top problems. It's the top problem in healthcare, one of the top problems in all the polls that they identify. And as Abraham Lincoln once said, public sentiment is everything until you run into campaign financing. But it should be everything, and it eventually will be everything, and we will get this done.
No, there's a lot in that answer, and I want to
Really?
come back to I want to come back to some of the specifics, but I want to talk about the growth in spending for a moment. Part of that it's attributable certainly to market dynamics. Part of that to an aging population, but some part of that is we're in the middle of an explosively innovative moment in pharmaceuticals right now. And do you worry that that intervening and sort of putting a bigger regulatory structure on top of pharmaceutical research and development at the moment will perhaps hinder that innovation, and that we wouldn't know it until a decade after it's happened?
No, because I am not talking about regulating their research or their innovation or even their approvals. In fact, I've been all in favor of speeding up approvals for both for pharmaceuticals and medical device to get life-saving drugs or life-saving medical devices out sooner. What I don't like is that we are in a capitalist system, and I like that, but I don't like when it's not working because we're not allowing competition in. So you are correct that for rare orphan drugs and rare diseases, I actually head up that caucus with Senator Hatch. You will have drugs come up that you want to make sure are able to be launched and get out there. And that is part of the issue, but that pales in comparison to the fact that we have mainstream drugs that have no competition. Like, for instance, what just happened with EpiPen, which was resolved after public pressure came on, right? It would have gone up 3 times the amount to $600, $800. So that's why I think if we believe in capitalism, and then means we have to have competition. Otherwise, this is never going to work. So how do you get there is more the questions that I get to while still allowing innovation. In my mind, competition fosters more innovation because you have to find lesser expensive but effective and safe ways to deliver drugs or to produce drugs. And it means that you're going to innovate because you want to get in front of your competitors. Well, that just doesn't happen when when you have only a few people charging high rates. So we get back to some of these solutions, which is to put some things in place to assure more competition. Number one, generics. There's something called the CREATES Act that Senator Leahy and Grassley and Senator Lee and myself have put out there. And That would make it easier for generics to sample the drugs from the big pharma companies so they can get their products out in the market, and how they do the safety protocols as well. Senator Lee and I have a bill that would trigger allowing, that's generics. We also have, one other, Grassley and I have a bill we can talk about more to stop the practice of pay for delay. I talked about it at the debate a week ago, which seems like a month ago.
Do you think that's going to get any traction?
I think it will, yes, because I would we need a vote. And if we have a vote, I would challenge, I can't see people like lemmings voting with the pharmaceutical companies, even though they're the biggest contributors. I can't see that happening when you have to explain to your constituents why you're going to allow a practice in place that says that the big pharmaceuticals can pay off generics to keep their products off the market. $2.9 billion taxpayers would save over 10 years. That is the Congressional Budget Office score. And I think that consumers would probably save an equal amount because of the copays and things like that. And so just think about it. Here you not only have less in competition, you have competitors paying each other to keep their products off the market. And Senator Grassley feels pretty strongly about that bill. So if we could get it up as a vote, as an amendment, most likely to a bill, I think it'd be really hard. That's one of those ones I think would pass in the Senate. I just do, because it would be hard to come up with arguments against it. They constantly are throwing safety in our face about drugs from Canada, for instance, which I think is somewhat absurd because we put in there clear safety protocols and which kinds of drugs and how they have to be able to pass muster to come into our country. But that would be my third bucket of things. So you've got things to promote generics. Well, first you have Medicare Part D on their own, but then you have negotiation. You've got things to promote generics, things to stop generics and pharma from helping each other so there's no competition. And then you have things to allow more foreign competition. You could just straight out allow it. You could straight out allow it for certain countries, the reimportation idea. And that's the bill I have with Senator McCain. Since we can see Canada from our porch in Minnesota, we like that one, right on our border. But you could also do it like Senator Lee and I have some version of this. You allow a trigger so that if you have a certain drug for which there has not been competition for a certain amount of time, or there's limited competition, then you could allow the drug to be reimported from another safe drug from another country. So it kind of hangs out there so they know that that's going to happen if they keep stomping on competitors.
You have, as you've noted, reached across the aisle a few times on a few pieces of legislation with Senator McCain, as you've mentioned, with Senator Lee. But we've seen over the past few months much more failure of legislation on health care in Congress than success.
Well, it depends on what you propose.
So what would you say is
Proposals.
what is the legislative pathway that you're looking to have some of your priorities succeed?
Well, for instance, we did pass Medufa and PDUFA, but then they got a new name because the name sounded so weird. But those were the bills that allowed for the FDA. It was basically FDA reauthorization, but allowed for funding actually from industries to help fund some of the reviewers so that we can move these products along more quickly. So that did pass. I'm hopeful we'll be able to get the CHIPS bill done eventually. And then we can talk maybe at the end here about the work of Senator Murray and Senator Alexander. I'm hopeful on that too. So I think some things have gotten done, and certainly over the years we've gotten a number of things done in healthcare. I think the issue is that we need to fix the Affordable Care Act, and the reason you've seen these failures is because these have all been bills to basically get rid of the Affordable Care Act, to repeal it, to kick millions of people off health care insurance, to the last version, the Graham-Cassidy one, to severely cut Medicaid, and all kinds of things that were out there that started to bring very strange bedfellows together so that the insurers and AARP and Kasich and Bernie Sanders were all on the same side. That means a trouble for a bill overall. So those kinds of things were happening. So I think you can't really measure whether we can move on health care or not by these latest votes, because I think those votes were smart votes in terms of saying this isn't the way the public wants to go and we have to do better. On the other hand, you've got this big mammoth bill, the Affordable Care Act, and you can't pass legislation of that magnitude, nor have we done that in the history of America, without then coming in and making some changes as time goes on. You're going to have problems with it. And we've had some issues with the exchanges. That's one of them. The second one is what I've identified here, the drug prices. So I think it's easier, as I hope we will show in the next month or two, to make some changes to stabilize those exchanges and bring costs down. Delivery system reform is hard sometimes because some states like mine are more cost effective than others, and that's hard. But we could make more changes with delivery system reform if you talk to someone like Atul Gawande. And I've always been a proponent of that, and I thought we didn't do enough in the first bill, though we got a good start on it. You could do something again, and I'll go back to our topic here, on farmer prices. So how do you do that? Well, one way could have been with the PDUFA type thing, the FDA reauthorization. That didn't happen, and that was kept off of there on the committee level. And so my guess is it'll be more like amendment votes in the Senate. As you know, if you're going to bring up a whole bill by itself, it takes a week or so, and leadership on both sides basically has to let you do that. And we've just been unsuccessful to date in trying to get those bills up. So I see this more as some major amendment vote to some other bill, whether it's an end-of-year bill, whether it is the health care bill that they're working on now, although people will really want to preserve that. There's just got to be some way. And I think you're going to start seeing the public outcry against both parties if we don't do any votes at all on any of this. The Democratic Party is very interested in pushing the Medicare Part D negotiations. I lead that version of that bill in the Senate and will be leading that amendment. And the president has said he supports it. So maybe, lo and behold, that could surprise everyone and something like that happens. I'm just not certain on what bill we will vote for that. And what will happen, will some Republicans join us on the Medicare Part D? I think the one thing we could say is votes have been unpredictable and exciting lately. So we really don't know. We don't really know what's going to happen. When Rand Paul's over there going over to Speaker Ryan's office with a camera and a copy machine trying to find the first version of the repeal bill, I didn't really think I'd be retweeting Rand Paul, but I did it. And so I think that, you just don't know what's going to happen here. So I'd say the Medicare Part D is going to be the big emphasis. On the Republican side, I'm not sure which bill that they would see as the least onerous. But, you could see that pay for delay one. It can be a pay for in a bill. That could be in some who knows what bill, right? Because it raises $2.9 billion. So you could see it being stuck in some health care bill to pay for something. All the importation bills, those are probably the hardest, although we picked up 14 votes on the Canada one. We also passed the drug shortage bill. I led that with Casey and Susan Collins. And that bill surprised everyone when it passed, and it really only happened because John LaPook of CBS Reporter, who I didn't even know at the time, started asking people at leadership press conferences why they weren't letting the drug shortage bill come up for a vote. And then all of a sudden it got on the agenda, it got through the committee after we'd been trying for so long, and then it passed, and then he won an Emmy. So just for any reporters out there, I just want,
Thank you for the tip.
No, but I just think, I think that people, he won an Emmy for that, not for something else. I think that the more that people can start talking about these individual proposals as opposed to just, drug prices are high, bring them down, disaster. I just think that would be interesting. These are not crazy proposals. They're not like, they're all individual things attacking one problem.
So let's tunnel in for a moment on the nature of this particular market. I mean, you talked about all being good capitalists, yes, competition is a key vehicle for reducing prices. But healthcare and prescription pharmaceuticals, especially above all, is this fiendishly complex system. It's not straightforward. One of the criticisms of your approach to preventing what you call pay for delay agreements is that it would effectively hand over a bunch of power to the FTC, adding another regulatory layer on top of a system that's already slow in getting treatments to patients. But how do you think about introducing new regulations and new requirements in a system that's already as complex as it is? How does that actually reduce price?
Well, in a way, I want to have less regulations in some things. I don't want to have that regulation that says Medicare can't negotiate prices. So I want to allow for the seniors to be unleashed. The silver tsunami coming at those drug prices. I'm going to get in trouble for saying that because it's too negative. The silver surge coming at them. So I think, I think that that's not necessarily true when you're trying to sort of unleash an entrepreneurial spirit among our population. As far as the FTC, I mean, sometimes the argument made on the pay for delay is that it's somehow necessary to settle patent suits and things like that. And the Supreme Court actually had a ruling where they decreased the number of those pay for delay agreements anyway, because it used to be saving even more money. And then the world didn't come to an end. So I just don't see that is going to cause Armageddon to happen here. I just don't. Nor does Senator Grassley, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, or he wouldn't be leading the bill. So there's that one. And then the drugs from other countries. I mean, every other industry in America has competition, the last time I checked, from foreign companies. We prefer to have all this in America, right? American companies. But when you have American companies that keep jacking up their prices, you've got to bring in some competition to bring those prices down for consumers. And I actually think some kind of trigger where those companies would come in. Now that gets into really interesting regulatory issues. What is the trigger? How do you measure it if prices go up for a certain drug? But if we could find some way to do that, my guess is that would have a really nice effect of keeping prices down because they don't want the competitors to come in.
Do you think that the U.S. should have a role in effectively subsidizing pharmaceutical innovation for the rest of the world?
I think the U.S. should have a role in innovation. I mean, that is one of the reasons that we have such a strong pharmaceutical industry, such a strong medical device industry. We have seen some government-funded research as part of what has been good for our country. It's why we've been able to be a leader in so many areas, and certainly you've seen that everywhere from the internet that Al Gore, remember, invented.
Yeah, I do.
Yes, and he was like, no, but you saw you saw that in many, the original Bell Labs that then led to our innovation in that area, and then of course later that went away, and then we had the breakdown of the Bell companies that went to a much more competitive situation. Or you look at energy with the energy research that goes on. I think ag research, Bill Gates comes every year and talks to me and other members of the ag committee about ag research and exciting things like barley rust and stuff like that. Why?
This is a crowd that seems like it would be exciting.
Okay, but they didn't cheer, but he sees that as part of how we're going to fix the world, how we're going to feed the world, right, with this kind of ag research. So I always think there's a place for that. I think the more interesting question is then, well, did the U.S. government get back some of their money if these companies are making so much money off their research? That was actually a case that was brought with I think it was a letter raised by members, including me, and then maybe there was some litigation over it, but it was to try to recoup some of the costs for the government that they had made. There's an argument there. But no, I've always believed in that. So
Let me come back to the price hike around the EpiPen, which you called the proverbial canary in the coal mine. What did the canary tell us? What do you take away from that?
that there's a lot of moms out there that can get really mad really fast. And that you found out, as I'm a mom with a kid with a severe nut allergy, and the minute I heard it, you also find out that there aren't that many moms with kids with nut allergies in the U.S. Senate, considering there are only 21 women senators. And so I knew immediately that this was Armageddon, because I knew that it's not just one EpiPen. They have to have one at school, one with them in their pocket or their purse, one at home, 2 get lost a year, and the whole thing. And so how much money that is, that's a lot of money. And so what happened there, I think the story there is just much more about public pressure and how, but not every drug is going to have that public pressure, right? Drugs for people in the later years of their life, they might not quite get that kind of social media presence like they did, or 1,000 people stopping by my state fair booth filling out cards about why they were mad about the EpiPen. But that really hit people hard because it was a mainstream drug, and that people understood this shouldn't have happened, and individual people had seen the costs go up, right? Like over 5 years, they'd actually seen it happen, so they knew. And then suddenly they realized, oh no, this isn't just my health plan, because it gets so confusing, right? This isn't just because I have a new insurance company. No, this isn't just because of this. This is because there's no competitors and I'm stuck getting this one this much. So the company eventually responded with the coupons and bringing the cost down, and then getting the generic out. I don't know where it is right now, but it did go down fairly dramatically. But you just should not have to launch a social media campaign and have people like lining up in front of your state fair booth in front of Bob's Snake Zoo, that's where I'm located, to bring the prices down of drugs. You should be able to get them down because you've got some rules of the road in place that incentivizes competition. The last time I checked, that's the kind of system we're supposed to be living in America. We're not North Korea.
So one more question for you, Senator. Why prescription drugs? It is part, certainly, of the growth in spending, but this is, again, a complex system with a lot of different costs. For a lot of attention accrued to the price hike in drugs and treatment for hepatitis C, for example, but the argument was made that we actually saved money that would have gone towards hospital visits and more expensive inpatient treatment. So why have you made prescription drugs the centerpiece of your priorities?
Well, 2 things. Number one, it actually is a lot. It's been growing. It's nearly 20% of our healthcare costs. When you include drugs used in the hospital setting, it's nearly 20% of our hospital costs. So that is not a small thing to mess around with and just say, oh, well, that's a problem, and no one wanted to do anything about it, so it's there. The second reason is because someone must do it. And honestly, the average contribution to a member of the Senate, I was asking them back in the green room what they thought it was, and someone guessed that it was for 1 year in 2016. Average was like, someone said, oh, $20,000, it's $75,000. So the pharmaceuticals are incredibly powerful, and that's fine, they have the power to do it. But I think there's got to be a few people willing to say, look, let's take this on in a big way. And there's a bunch of mavericks involved. That's kind of fun, McCain and Grassley and Bernie and others. And so there are a group of us that really want to take this on. And I think eventually something's going to have to change. And I hope the pharmaceutical companies realize that because we just can't keep going the way we are. So part of why I take it on is that I want to step in and do it. I tend to be more bipartisan than some of my colleagues. I had one of the highest or the highest record last year of co-sponsoring or sponsoring bills that passed. And this is an area where I've actually found some Republicans who are willing to work on it. And the last thing I'd say is right now the major focus is getting Lamar and Patty's work through. I think that could be a major help for the exchanges and shoring things up and show them good faith that people are willing to make some changes to the Affordable Care Act. And my hope is that will then pave the way to some prudent moves that we could make on pharma prices.
Senator Klobuchar, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
this way. Our next conversation will map the drug pricing debate. Why do Americans spend so much on prescription drugs? Here to consider that question, please welcome Lori Riley, the Executive Vice President of Policy and Research at the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of Association of America, aka PhRMA. Good morning, Lori. Thank you. Matt Iles, the Executive Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at America's Health Insurance Plans. Good morning, Matt. Thank you very much. So, Lori, rip rollicking conversation we're off to this morning. Start with what you heard and what you would push back on, if anything.
Well, that's going to be difficult. I was sitting in the green room, so I didn't get to hear much of it.
Yeah.
But I can probably anticipate a lot of what I heard.
One of the questions I asked was about a focus on prescription drugs.
Yeah.
And the senator made the point that this is an area where we have seen big growth over the past few years in spending, and that it's an area where she's seen both patient outcries and an opportunity for bipartisan collaboration to address the spending, the root causes of some of that,
Sure.
that increase in spending.
Okay, well, let me take a couple of those points. First, it's absolutely fair to say in 2014 and 2015, we saw a spike in prescription drug spending. A lot of that was due to a new cure for hepatitis C. In fact, about half of the spending growth in 2014 was as a result of that cure. Of course, it also happened to be in 2014 and 2015, we had record numbers of new drugs coming to the market. We also had the first year that the Medicaid expansion had occurred and the lowest number of drugs coming off patent. So yes, we saw a spike, but in my mind, it's not really smart from a policy perspective to take a look at just one period of time, meaning 1 year or 2 years. You got to look out over a period of time. So if you look back over the past decade, a recent IMS report found that per capita drug cost growth was at 1.1% on average per year over the last decade, 1.1% per year over the last decade. So again, not trivial, but in context, it's important. Prior to 2014 and 2015, there was almost anemic levels of prescription drug spending growth. Again, we had a peak. This past year, growth was anywhere from 3 to 5%, and all projections suggest over the next decade it's going to be stable. Prescription drugs still account for about 14% of total prescription drug spending across the country. That's both medicines used at the retail pharmacy as well as medicines that are used in the hospital setting and the physician spending. And again, that's projected to remain stable. An important point to note too, that 14%, half of it is brand drugs. So 7 of that 14%, half is brand drugs. The other half is generic drugs and the costs associated with the supply chain. Kind of an interesting point of comparison, we spend about 8% on administrative costs in this country. So we're spending more on administrative costs than we're spending on prescription drugs in the US. And I would argue that we're getting a lot for that 14% or 7% in the case of brand name drugs. We've got new cures for hepatitis C. We have a revolution in cancer therapies. We've made tremendous progress against HIV/AIDS, and there's a lot more promise in the pipeline to come.
Now, every number in this arena is contested, and so that 14% is one of those figures. I'm curious. One of the complex dynamics of this market is the fact that we can't actually see into some of what goes into drug companies, pharmaceutical researchers' decisions. Why should we give pharmaceutical manufacturers as much power as we do to set prices?
Well, I would argue that pharmaceuticals, probably unlike any part of the healthcare system, the negotiation for the ultimate price of that product is negotiated between a manufacturer and oftentimes a pharmacy benefit manager or an insurance company. So today, about 75% of every prescription medicine is purchased by just 3 pharmacy benefit managers. And they have significant sway over the price of medicines. Example, over the past 3 years, we've seen rebates and discounts that pharmaceutical companies provide increase almost 40%, to the tune of about $106 billion in 2015 in discounts and rebates. So those prices are negotiated in a very competitive market where insurance companies say, if you don't give us the price you want, we're not going to cover your product. If you increase the price, we're going to ask you to pay an additional rebate on top of it, a price protection rebate. If you don't give us the price you want, you're going to be on the highest tier of the formulary, and we're going to ask patients to pay an increasingly large share of their costs. So to say that prescription medicines, there's not significant negotiation, I think is a huge misnomer. There is a lot of negotiation that's happening, and it plays out in publicly available data in terms of rebates and the like.
Matt, that is almost a segue to you. You've been on both sides on two sides of this multifaceted.
I'm a
debate,
reformed
shall we say.
pharmaceutical executive.
you were at Pfizer for several years, and now you're at AHIP. And how has that informed your view of the way we construct this challenge?
Great question. Thanks for having me here. So the world is very different today in which pharmaceutical companies operate, I think, compared to, say, about a decade ago, right? And there are some good things and some bad things. The good things. Some of the treatments are really breakthrough, and being able to provide more targeted therapies, that is terrific. That said, we face enormous challenges, I think, from a systemic perspective, when you look at cost, when you look at prices. We have really a price problem in the United States. And remember the old James Carville adage, it's the price, stupid, not the economy in this case, because our unit prices are much too high. When you look at launch prices in the United States, our launch prices are very high. And we see rates of price increases across our system, despite the use of negotiations through pharmacy benefit managers and our members. As a result of the system that we've created, whereby we essentially have government-granted monopolies, right, that give market exclusivity for extended periods of time. We have patent estates that wrap around this period of market exclusivity, and you have to ask yourself, why is it 20-plus years that we've seen some of the most expensive biologics out on the market, and we do not have a true biosimilars market in the United States. I remember being in the industry, a decade ago and saying, oh, we need to talk about, biosimilars are coming. Here we are 10 years later, and we barely have any biosimilars competition. We need some real market to evolve in that place. I mean, I don't know that anyone believes that we will ultimately get to the commodity type prices that you see when a small molecule genericized market comes out. Where you see 90, 95% discounts. But if we are only going to be able to realize, say, 15 or 20% savings on these products, we are going to maintain our affordability problem in the United States.
Now, doesn't some of the upfront pricing for pharmaceuticals, for new pharmaceuticals, fund a big part of the introduction of later new drugs?
Sure, in some level, right, that pharmaceutical companies need to pay for research and development. But it is a fundamental fallacy of the industry, of the pharmaceutical industry, that there's any direct connection between the cost of research and development for a particular product and its price. I've sat in numerous pricing committee discussions, launching products. Not once did anyone say, how much do we spend on R&D for this product? It really was, what would the market bear? What is out there from a competitive landscape, if there is anything, and how much can we charge in that regard? And so, that's one of the big problems, and there have been some recent studies that look at the overall cost of research and development, right? And there's the sort of pharma aggregate number where they fold in every single product, every single cost, and come up with a very inflated number of, say, about $2 billion to, bring a new drug to market. There was a recent study that came out that said it's a lot lower than that, probably a couple $100 million. That's not to say that we want to get it get these products out there more efficiently, but it's not $2 billion to bring every product to market.
Lori, let me offer
Yeah.
you the chance to respond to this.
I have a lot to respond
Yes,
to.
yes.
I'm gonna start though, so I don't forget to make the point. You know, Matt talked about what's different in the pharmaceutical industry over the last 10 years. I want to talk about what's different in the insurance industry in the last 10 years. We're now at a point in time where patients are being asked to pay a lion's share of their costs, to the point of, I would argue, it doesn't feel like insurance to a lot of patients. Today, for many patients, they have deductibles. They never used to have deductibles for prescription medicines. They do today, oftentimes as high as $3,000 or $4,000. When they go to the pharmacy counter at the beginning of the month, they're asked to pay the list price of the drug. Insurance companies and pharmacy benefit managers are not passing on the discounts and rebates that we provide to them on to the patient at the point of sale. And that's a problem because today we have, again, an increasing number of patients who are paying $3,000 or $4,000, maybe going through most of the year till they feel like they have insurance. When they get to the phase of their insurance, an increasing number of them are asked to pay a % of the price of the list price of the drug. So again, not reflecting the rich discounts and rebates that are provided to them. So, you know, that has changed significantly. And quite honestly, that is in part why patients today are struggling to afford their medicine. It's not like the days of 5 years ago when you went to the pharmacy counter January 1 and you paid a flat copay for your drug. Today, you go to the pharmacy counter and you're asked to pay the list price month after month after month until you reach your deductible, and then you're asked to pay a % of the price of it. So that's one point, and that is in part, I think, a big reason that's fueling this debate. On the research and development cost, you know, our companies go to work every day to bring new cures and treatments to patients. Unfortunately, the business model we have is not a great one in terms of success stories, right? 90% of what we do fails. And let me just give you one example, Alzheimer's. We have one of our companies that's invested to date over $3 billion over the last 25 years trying to get a treatment to the market for Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death in this country. It's the only one in the top 10 where there is no treatment that cures, prevents, or delays its onset. It's going to cost our society $1 trillion by 2050. Right? We need companies to make those kinds of investments. But how can we make an investment of $3 billion and fail and fail and fail if there's not an ability to, again, recoup not just those costs for the ones that make it to market, but for all of those that never make it to market?
Yeah, this is one of the key factors that differentiates some of those figures that you were citing, isn't it, Matt? That, you know, the 200 million figure is a parsimonious view, perhaps, of what
It's probably higher than that, but still, there is a big gulf between.
Right. So, how would you say we should think about innovation, and particularly the U.S.'s distinctive role in innovation in how we price pharmaceuticals in America?
Right. I mean, we are funding the rest of the world. There's no doubt of it. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's been happening for decades, and you know that trend is not changing, particularly as other countries, you know, continue to sort of clamp down on prices in a way that we have not. And that's a particular challenge. I'd say from a pricing perspective, though, what's also important to think about is really what is a price that, you know, is reasonable to give a rate of return that does not try and capture sort of the entire value, the entire net present value of all direct and indirect medical costs. I mean, that's where we've seen pricing going in the United States, is that companies are trying to extract every single last dollar from the healthcare system and even indirect costs and trying to justify their prices. When they have a very, very high launch price. And I think we need to have a conversation about like what makes sense, what's sustainable, and what is reasonable, right? Pharmaceutical companies are the only part of the healthcare system that really doesn't have this level of transparency into how it's operating with respect to how prices get set. Every insurance product that's out there in the market has some level of oversight through state departments of insurance, through the federal government. There's nothing equivalent that exists in the pharmaceutical industry. We need some basic transparency in the system to understand really how is it that these prices are being arrived at, what are some of the inputs, and what makes sense, because it really is the only part of the healthcare system where that doesn't exist right now.
We have represented here pharmaceutical companies, we have payers represented here. But a big part of the obfuscation and the complexity, the opacity of healthcare as a market is the distance between customers and the things that they're paying for. What do you think, how do we improve the whole system for getting more of a market dynamic into healthcare and drug pricing?
Right. And I do think it comes back to this notion of transparency, of greater transparency of what the inputs are into pharmaceutical companies.
But I guess I would ask, do you think many decisions made by, for example, providers in the hospital setting are also a core part of what's driving an increase in spending? And what responsibility do you think that our providers have in considering other alternatives to things that might just be habit?
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of effort to provide much greater transparency across the entire system so that providers who are being able, or not who are being able, who are being asked to accept more responsibility for financial outcomes, not just healthcare outcomes, are looking at what are the inputs going into the total cost of care. And pharmaceuticals, obviously, depending upon what therapeutic area you're talking about, can play a very big part. And it's important that we include those drug costs when we're looking at the total cost. In many cases, they're outside. For example, in the Medicare Shared Savings Program, with the whole ACO concept, right? Part D costs aren't really factored in directly in the same way. Many health plans, as they're looking at their commercial business and the arrangements that they're putting out with health systems, are trying to factor in the total costs to make sure that the incentives are aligned and that providers are looking at what are the costs, including drugs, of providing care for particular patients.
Can I jump in terms of the question that I think you asked, which is the supply chain? As you mentioned, we have a very complex supply chain where we sell a product. There was a recent study that came out in January that found that of every dollar of list price of a prescription drug sold, the manufacturer, the brand name manufacturer, retains about 62 cents of it. The rest of that, almost 40 cents, is going to other people in the supply chain. I mentioned before a big chunk of it that goes in the form of discounts and rebates to health insurance companies, mandated government rebates that have to get paid to them, the cost that goes to the pharmacy benefit managers, the pharmacies, and the wholesalers. And Matt talked a lot about transparency, but again, we'd like to see transparency across the entire supply chain, including in the hospital setting where drugs are commonly marked up as much as 600% over the price charged. So transparency is great, presuming it applies to everyone, including the health plans, in terms of how much of the rebates and discounts they retain and use for whatever purposes they want, and how much of it actually gets passed back to the ultimate patient who needs those discounts and rebates.
Lori, a big part of the debate as it plays out publicly is driven by some pretty striking stories. The senator and I talked about the EpiPen hike earlier in the year. And those are a big vehicle for an engine for a lot of the patient outcry that we see around pricing. How should we think about a drug that costs suddenly 3 times what it did 2 years ago?
Right. Well, unfortunately, there have been a number of stories, whether it was Daraprim, the HIV/AIDS drug that took a huge increase in price, or the issue with EpiPen. We've been on the record saying that more needs to be done to ensure that we speed the entry of competing products to market. I would argue in the case of Daraprim, you had an example of a company that took advantage of regulatory arbitrage. They knew at the time that any competitor that tried to get a competing generic to the marketplace would face years in terms of FDA approval of that product. I think more is being done, and I would argue that Scott Gottlieb has done a great job already of advancing some ideas that hopefully we won't end up in those kinds of situations. But I would say today that regulatory arbitrage existed for a long time. We need to stop that because we do need to speed entry of products to compete.
How do you feel about some of Senator Klobuchar's bipartisan efforts to introduce just competition just like that, like the Short on Competition Act. Which
Well, you know, there's lots of different ideas in terms of how we address drug costs, and I would say we've put forth a number of ideas as well. I mentioned one already, which is how do we ensure that discounts find their way back to the ultimate patient. We also think more needs to be done to encourage purchasing around the value of medicine. We understand the health system is changing, that the days of buying medicines based on volume are likely over. We hear consistently from payers that they want to pay for value of medicines. We want to meet them in that point, but we need help from government in terms of looking at, I would say, outdated regulations that haven't been updated to reflect this kind of movement going forward. We also, as I mentioned before, need to advance FDA regulatory changes as well to ensure that we speed the entry of competing products to market. So there are ideas, absolutely ideas to lower drug costs in this country. We've been very, outward suggesting an agenda of our own in order to do that. So we're not saying that there's not a problem, no one should look here, but I think some of the solutions that we've heard, I worry about the impact, the long-term impact to innovation down the road.
In a few moments, I'd like to bring in a couple of audience questions, and keeping in mind that this is quite a complex, multifaceted issue, and I'd love to hear from some perspectives that we haven't heard represented on stage. But first, I want to ask you both a question. Where do you find the most agreement?
Where do we find the most agreement? So I'd say probably in the area of competition. How do we make sure that we get products to market more quickly, whether they be on the generic side or if there's no competing therapy within a particular class, so that we can get some competition? I'd say that's probably one area. I'd say the other is around the move towards value-based pricing. However, I'd say there's a lot more skepticism, I'd say, on my side of the house about whether or not value-based pricing will actually lead to net reductions in spending. And are we going to solve our pricing problem by going to that type of system? I think everyone wants to pay for value, but I think the jury is definitely out about how those agreements will ultimately impact spending within and the pricing problems that we face. Right, the insidious pricing problem that we have really is not the extreme examples. It's the year-over-year inflation of 9, 10, 20%. When you have companies out there, raising their hand and saying, "I'm a good actor. I'm going to raise, prices less than double digits," and they come in at 9.9%. When the rest of the healthcare system is much, much lower, and really trying to put, that's not great corporate behavior. That's just not the way that that we're going to address some of the problems that we face. And when that is rampant across the branded industry, and you have companies who are now backing off from some of these pledges, you're like, what's really going on here?
Well, I would like to address that before I talk about what we agree with. So last year, price growth in the pharmaceutical industry was 2.5%. Of course, there are examples. There's always going to be examples where there are products that are raised higher than 2.5%. But the average across the entire pharmaceutical industry was 2.5%. There's been a lot of attempts by pharmacy benefit managers and insurers to keep prices low. I mentioned one of them before, where most PBMs today have contracts in place which say if you raise your price above a certain level, you have to rebate us back additional money as a way to keep prices low. So I think we're in a different era in terms of price growth relative to where we've been.
Now bring us all together.
Bring us all together. Okay. I do think, to Matt's point, that how do we pay for outcomes? How do we pay for value? Is one where we do agree. I've heard some of the criticism that Matt is saying, but I would say a recent study by Humana and Pfizer found, in the case of cholesterol, that you could have 22% lower costs as a result of an outcomes-based contract. So I think there is hope there. We're still in the infancy of these, so obviously there will be more coming forward, but our companies are committed to a different pricing model and one that's based on value.
Let me share the stage and hear some questions back there.
Hi, this is Evan Shore. I had a question.
Please state just who you are and where you're from for us.
Just independent person.
All right.
Was wondering, in a lot of other industries, you don't have these intermediaries that are negotiating prices, and you get this competition and nice market dynamics. here you have payers and PBMs that are in the middle, and value-based pricing would be in the vein of the negotiated prices as well. Might there be an opportunity to create a marketplace that the pharma companies come in and post their prices, and so maybe starting in self-pay consumers, there's just a much simpler infrastructure, and then you won't have that 40% of the cost of a drug.
My sense is we're going to see disruption in this marketplace for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. Increasingly, we're seeing states do reverse auctions with their pharmacy benefit manager to try and lower the cost, because quite honestly, the value that is created in the system is created by the creation of the medicine, but 40% of the price is getting eaten by others in the supply chain. So I think there is more to be done to squeeze some of the costs out of that supply chain. The good news about consolidation in the PBM and insurance industry has been significant competition, right? That has led to these really, really big rebates. That's all great if patients are benefiting directly from them. But today those rebates and discounts are kept, and they're kept because Matt's companies want to lower premiums, a laudable goal. But for a lot of patients who rely on medicines, the end result is they're paying much more so than what their insurance company is paying for that medicine. We think that needs to change.
I think that's not commonplace within the industry. So think about, one thing that's important to remember is the market dynamic that you're talking about. It can't be a true market when you have a government-granted monopoly through the patent system or through market exclusivity. So that's one point. The second point is that the whole rebate discussion, rebates were actually created by the pharmaceutical industry many decades ago as a way to discriminate against different classes of trade. And I won't get into all the details around that, but it was really an artifact of the pharmaceutical industry that was created. And when you think about the prices of products, let's say there was a rebate of 20% on a $1,000 a month product. Do you think a patient feels any better if they were paying $800 a month instead of $1,000 a month? Going into the pharmacy, it really starts with the price. And if prices were lower, we wouldn't have this problem.
Over here in the back. And once again, tell us who you are and what your affiliation, if anything, is.
Thank you very much. My name is Edward Abrahams. I'm from the Personalized Medicine Coalition. So one of the great opportunities to increase value and actually reduce systemic costs would be to figure out for whom particular drugs work and for whom they don't work. My question is to Matt. In order to do that, you've got to link therapy to diagnostics, and yet there's continued downward pressure from payers on diagnostics, that, especially those that have not met controlled randomized clinical trial standards. What can payers do to help advance this vision of targeting therapy to patients for whom they work and for whom they don't?
Right, and I think that that's another area of alignment, is wanting to get the right product to the right patient at the right time at the lowest possible cost. Right, when we're talking about these very targeted therapies, we're getting into a whole new frontier, both in terms of pricing, the need for diagnostics. We've seen more collaborations between manufacturers and payers, especially bringing this information early in the process, and that's something, probably another area where we've been supportive of working on together. But I think it is a challenge, if we're talking about a product to just put out a hypothetical price, say of $1 million that we've heard for some of these new therapies out there, we still need to figure out, like, how do we get to the fundamental price issue and how do we solve this problem? Because at that price, you're talking about the ability to provide insurance coverage for, say, 40 or 50 families for one therapy, and we want to get those targeted therapies to people, but at a price I think that we can afford, and that's just a discussion that we're going to have to, have on an ongoing basis.
I want to move to one more question here.
Brian Bruin with George Washington University. So one thing that I heard in this discussion is actually a possible area for collaboration between the two industries, and that you both brought up rebates and the fact that they're not necessarily being passed through. And then you also, Lori, talked about the fact that so much of that is then, so much of the price is captured throughout the supply chain. Almost all of that is based on the initial price that's set by manufacturers. So why don't we just get rid of this whole silly rebate system, make the prices public, make them lower, and then the costs throughout the supply chain are lower. The amount that's kept is lower. It's more obvious for patients. Patients don't pay as much at the pharmacy counter because that's based on the initial price. And then we're all happy and prices are lower.
Amen.
Yeah, I think, I think there's been a lot of talk about what needs to change because you're right. The supply chain today, everyone along that chain gets paid off the list price, right? The pharmacies, the wholesalers, the pharmacy benefit managers.
Who sets the list
They
price?
get paid off the, well, guess what? Guess who likes a high list price though, right? People that get a big discount and rebate off of
They would
that list
prefer
price.
a lower net price.
Well,
I guarantee you.
I
They would
think
prefer a lower net
history
price.
begs to differ in terms of their coverage decisions. And I think if you look at how they make coverage decisions, it's quite interesting in terms of do they give preferential coverage to low list prices or do they give them to ones with high discounts and rebates?
Lori, I want to give you the opportunity to have the last word right now. What you get a laser scalpel, and you get to redesign one giant corner of our healthcare industry to lower the cost of drug pricing for ordinary folks. Where do you put it?
I would require that the majority of discounts and rebates get passed through. I will tell you if that happens, patients' costs will be lower. There'll be less incentive to game the system.
All right. Lori Riley, Matt Isles, thank you very much for joining us this
Thank you,
morning, and
Matt.
thanks to the rest of you. I look forward to a rollicking discussion for the rest of today. Great day. Thank you.
Next, please welcome Pennsylvania Congressman Patrick Meehan for a view from the House. Here with the Congressman is journalist Kathleen Koch.
Good morning, Congressman. Thank you for joining
Kathleen.
us.
Great to be with you and the audience.
Now, I don't know if you all know the Congressman's wife is a nurse practitioner, so I'm guessing the subject comes up once or twice, high drug prices, in your conversation.
Well, certainly the whole concept of how people are using drugs is a part of our conversation. I talk about it more, she talks about it more in the concept of education and adherence, because in addition to being a nursing professor now, and she teaches in a broad concept of, we educate in children, so she has a second job in which she continues to do community-based nursing and goes into the homes of patients oftentimes after they've been discharged. There's a great deal of education associated with people understanding the meds that they're on, having the family support that, but also having the patient appreciate that adherence to that regimen is so critical to staving off a rehospitalization. And that's where the costs are. That's where the enormous, in addition to those who don't abide by the drugs that are prescribed, because if you don't have a baseline, you can't make adjustments, you can't determine whether something is working or not working, and we lose all of that valuable time, oftentimes at the most critical stage when somebody's just finished a hospitalization and they're still really in probably today a rather medically unstable position.
Talking healthcare costs, let's talk healthcare reform. Obviously, last week, Republicans weren't really able to get the support that they needed to push forward the Graham-Cassidy bill and the repealing of Obamacare. Some are saying it's really become obvious now that you're not going to be able to move healthcare reform forward without Democrats and Republicans collaborating and cooperating. Do you think that's possible? And if it is, how is that going to impact the cost of prescription drugs for Americans?
I think that's a good question. Right now, we're still in, okay, what's next? And I think as we are working on tax reform, it's not going to be the immediate bounce to what's next. And we're watching to see what Alexander and Mary do in the Senate to see if there's a next play in healthcare in the short run. But regardless of what may come in, and I think there's going to have to be something to fill that void because we're still left with uncertainty with things like risk corridor sharing and things of that nature. We're going to have to resolve some of those questions. That's where the opportunity comes to begin to look at other kinds of saving things. There's going to be movement on the parts of my colleagues to deal with the drug on, the medical device tax, things of that nature. But it's a space in which one of the issues that I'm working on, which is to try to move away from the fee-for-service mechanism, not just in healthcare delivery generally, but also tying some of the great things that are helping in overall care and making sure that the pharmaceutical section participates in that as well.
Now, are you talking now about, it sounds like, values-based pricing?
Very much so.
Explain to us what that is, and who do you think would benefit if we start to go in that direction with pharmaceuticals?
Well, value-based pricing changes the care model, one in which we're looking to take advantage of outcomes as opposed to payment per pill. And it works not just, it's value versus volume. And it anticipates that there may be certain costs associated with that, but our overall goal is to look down the road and see what the costs are to non-adherence or the unavailability of certain kind of breakthrough drugs, which can change outcomes. And so we're looking at a situation in which if we can find ways to deliver drugs that work on individuals, especially as we start moving towards specialized medicine, we're going to hold down overall costs to the system, in addition to patient suffering. I mean, these are things in which the breakthroughs, as well as adherence to those which are currently available, are things in which we can make great inroads. But there's impediments to that, like the kickback laws and things that I'm working on trying to get around.
Do you think that the 115th Congress is the one that's going to be able to act on drug pricing reform? Because that does seem to be an area where there is more bipartisan support. And Senator Klobuchar was just here on stage earlier this morning saying, we have to change. I mean, now is the time.
I'd love to say yes. There's a lot on the plate right now with tax reform and infrastructure and other kinds of issues. I just got to be realistic about what is going. My wife has a saying, and I think this is what we need to look at. Everybody's looking for the instant fix on healthcare. That, okay, we got this plan tomorrow, it's going to be fixed and we're going to go. And my wife laughs at me and she goes, it took us 20 years to get into this. It's going to take us as long to get this right. We've got to continue to work at it piece by piece. And that's why I'm so focused on trying to support the ability for the delivery of innovative new drug therapies to patients that can benefit from them and find the mechanisms to deliver that in a way that moves us to a more, not just more effective, but a more cost-effective way to do it.
But still, it's got to be frustrating to go piece by piece, take this deliberate approach, because you yourself, I mean, one of the causes that's near and dear to you in Pennsylvania is combating the opioid epidemic, and you have seen drugs like naloxone going up, 17 times in price over the past 2 years. People who need that medication can't wait. And well, why do you think that's happening? Just taking a look at naloxone, because it is a generic available in multiple varieties, and generally that means the price comes down. What's happening there?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously you would suspect that there might be some matter of just competition for it, in the sense that it's now everywhere. I mean, policemen are carrying it in their cars. Individuals are now keeping it at home. So some element of demand. But I have to think that there's also a recognition whenever you get in. I haven't studied it close enough. We've really worked more on trying to assure that those who are in a position to be able to deliver it, have it, so that we expand the number of people who can make it available for those in need.
Let's talk about the FDA. In the past, the FDA has really focused on drug efficacy, drug safety, and now we have a new FDA commissioner, Commissioner Gottlieb, who has been very vocal and very activist about pharmaceutical pricing and, for instance, promoting the creation of more generic drugs via the Drug Competition Action Plan. What do you think about that? How is he working with Congress?
Well, I think Scott Gottlieb's doing a great job in terms of really sitting back and looking and thinking, how can I approach the system of delivering drugs to individuals where it can make a difference? I think he's looking at two ways. I think he's looking at it to assure that they break down the prohibitions that have been, whether somebody's been gaming the system or otherwise influencing the ability to challenge existing drugs once they go off patent. Making sure that the drugs available to be compared, to be tested. So Gottlieb's looking at those kinds of things which may be done, which are delaying the process, the pay for delay, challenging whether or not once something's on, off patent, that it's going to continue to be manipulated in a way that the generic doesn't get on the market. So that's sort of going against the negatives of the system, but is also working simultaneously on trying to expand the communication that takes place, where we've got drugs that are not yet FDA approved, but there's a lot of information out there about things that are being done, either off-label or otherwise, and trying to, also in accordance with some of the great work that was done by Fred Upton in the last Congress with the 21st Century Cures, in which we're trying to expand the availability of information that will help people developing generics.
Let's talk about the head of another agency. Some say that the head of Health and Human Services, the secretary, ought to be able to negotiate drug prices like the head of the VA does. What would be wrong with that?
I think the HHS director's got a lot on their plate, and one more responsibility like that may be sound good on paper, but in my mind, this is probably left best to those that are in the position to really negotiate effectively.
And who would that be?
Well, I think that you're seeing drug plans and otherwise, doing a pretty good job. They understand the
PBMs?
market. Well, PBMs are included in there. They certainly understand the market. The best of anybody. They can work on volume. They can work on other kinds of incentives, and I'm working to try to change that to enable a lot more collaboration and to clear the prohibitions from the anti-kickback statutes, the Stark laws, and things of that nature. We also have, seen something where the VA does negotiate prices, but when I talk to some of the VA folks, you get lower prices in some spaces, but you also get reduced availability. And as we're working towards more specialized medicine, and we're looking at the next level of breakthrough drugs, I think is 50% of the new drug development is going to be in specialty drugs. And we oftentimes talk about this as one great big system, not recognizing great progress has been made with generics and other kinds of competition. $1.7 trillion saved from was estimated by virtue of introducing generics into the markets. Part D has turned out to be better. But we're also looking at most of the innovation now taking place, 30% for cancer. Great that we're moving into this. We're looking into things like gene therapy and other brand new ways to attack illness that are really, really exciting, some of it expensive. So we don't want to not make that available to those who could benefit from it. So I think that sometimes that sounds good on paper. I'm not so sure with all the HHS has on its plate that that's the best use of their time.
The president himself has really used the bully pulpit on the subject of prescription drugs. He's tweeted about them. He's talked about drafting an executive order. He's also spoken out at rallies talking about the outrageous cost of prescription drugs. And there are some actually who are now crediting him for when this year, several different times when different pharmaceutical companies, Sanofi, Regeneron, and Roche, have unveiled new breakthrough drugs. They have actually unveiled them at a lower price than their competitors are offering. And some are saying, maybe that's because they are concerned about government intervention. I mean, when you see that kind of thing happening, do you think that's what's happening? Is it because of the president? Is it because of that pressure? And if so, does it make you go, darn, we should have gotten tough with them a long time ago ourselves?
Well, the bully pulpit can be a good thing, and I suspect that it certainly, there's a causal relationship. Whether it's 100%, I don't know, but the president's focus on this has certainly caused a lot of those in the industry to think about the long-term implications or even the short-term of what it would be to, be in his scope. It's a very powerful issue that resonates with constituents all across the country. I hear it almost regularly. I hear two things: property taxes and the cost of drugs, particularly among my senior population. So he struck a chord And I think him focusing on this is probably, I mean, I thought for 1 year, to my understanding, you know, the cost of drugs sort of flattened for a year. Now, there's been a small uptick of 1 or 2% in the last, in the last 6 months, but I think the bully pulpit works.
Do you think, though, it is hard for members of Congress to get tough with drug companies when, I mean, it's an open secret that they contribute more to lawmakers than any other industry?
You know, well, I mean, let me respond
the
to
number is, with Center for Responsive Politics, $3.6 billion over the last 20 years. It doesn't affect you?
You know, I get inspired by looking at the opportunity to do this job and to say, if I leave, what's a legacy going to be? And if I can have an impact, as small as it may be, in changing the way, in a more positive way that healthcare is delivered, that's going to help people. I mean, that's why most of my colleagues are here, even though we may disagree from both sides. And to be honest, I don't pay any attention to who is contributing with respect to the decisions you make, nor do I think most of my colleagues on the other side really do. And these campaigns are so expensive that, you know, you might think a $5,000 contribution means a lot, and it does, but not when you have a $3.5 million, primary.
Mm-hmm. You know, as a House Republican, how do you balance the need to reduce costs and then at the same time increase private sector market-based reforms? I mean, what is the balance between spending and innovation in your mind?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of R&D that's taking place right now, and you want to reward the ability for them to take that into the marketplace. We're working on trying to enable collaboration to break down some of the barriers that had prevented the willingness for the companies to look at, take the risk that if by collaborating with physicians in discussing ways in which they could give information or support systems. Again, I go back to adherence. 30% of the drugs are never even picked up that are prescribed, that are at a pharmacy. 50% of the drugs are not adhered to in the designed way. So if we can work on ways in which we can collaborate on value-based so that the outcomes are what drives the pricing, then you've got incentives for people to continue to make that adherence a part of the regimen. A lot more education, a lot more follow-up, and then the drugs work. And I think that's one of the ways in which we can not only reduce drug prices, but we can also find innovative ways to begin to pay for what are expensive new therapies. These one-time drugs that are going to cost, tens, sometimes even hundreds of thousands of dollars. How can you make it available for a life-changing thing, but a big upfront cost? And there may be innovative ways we can do that through this collaboration.
Speaking of innovative ways, you do have a number of different pieces of legislation in the hopper that could address this. Of those we haven't talked about, which do you think you'd like to share with the audience about? Do you think really have promise right now?
Yeah, well, I did mention. I think the thing that has the most promise is the Stark and anti-kickback laws, which effectively police what are perceived to be self-dealing. As a former federal prosecutor, I prosecuted these cases. I know when there are cases in which people are trying to manipulate the system.
Against drug companies?
Against drug companies, yeah.
With success?
We had some of the biggest settlements in the history of the, against some of the major drug companies, but I also appreciate that the collaboration in which they may be able to use systems to communicate with patients is now prevented. And if we get into these value-based, then it's not volume-based. We're not getting paid per pill. We're getting paid to see if this therapy can work and hold down what are subsequent cost to the system if somebody, instead of getting better, gets sick and gets rehospitalized. So we want to incent that collaboration, and we want to create safe harbors so that if people accord with the elements of this kind of an agreement, they're not afraid that just simply if one purpose of this collaboration is deemed to be a violation of the kickback statute, they can get huge penalties. And we want to get that risk pulled away from the willingness of people to work together because the future of healthcare is going to be collaboration from the delivery persons, from those who have the devices and drugs, and frankly, those who are the recipients and their families understanding what's happening to them and how to make smart choices. But I think adherence is also a critically important part. How to make sure they stay with that which has been prescribed for them to get better.
We'll go to audience questions in just a minute, so folks will get your thinking caps on, whatever you'd like to ask the congressman. It was interesting that you mentioned you'd had success in prosecuting pharmaceutical companies over their drug pricing back when you were a prosecutor. Is it at all frustrating ever? Do you feel like you had more success going after them then and bringing down prices than you have as a lawmaker on the Hill?
Well, I would suspect so, because I was one person and I could more directly impact things. When you're part of 400 and plus, it's not as easy. What we did was enforce best price violations so that we were able to make sure that there wasn't profiteering based on, among many other things, but best price was one of the major cases we did against one of the major drug companies. There's a lot of other factors that I think are more effective that we can be doing, and I've talked about a couple today to help drive down the costs.
All right, well, let's go to audience questions. Where are our mic runners? Here we go, got one back here.
Hi, my name is Meredith Basie. I'm the Executive Director for Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, and I have one question for you, Senator. The United States is one of the few developed countries in the world that doesn't regulate prices. So what are your barriers, given that the NIH invests $34 billion of US taxpayer funds every year to the most risky R&D, and yet the US pays prices like $129,000 for a prostate cancer drug, where across the border in Canada, that very same drug that was 100% funded by the taxpayer is $29,000.
Well, thank you for the promotion to the Senate, although I'm not so sure that is, at this day and age, I'm not even sure that's better. Look, you asked a question about R&D, and I think you've got to invest. These are hugely difficult things to find new therapies that are going to make a difference. And a lot of the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. And as we moved towards more specialized medicine delivery, greater understanding with the ability of computers to analyze broad amounts of data and other sorts of things, we have remarkable capacity to find new ways to make people better. You talked about the fact that America subsidizes a lot of the R&D and other countries benefit. There's ways in which some people suggest you're going to be able to, they're circumventing the system when they're taking drugs from Canada and across the seas and bringing them back in. We have to deal straight on with the question of how you get value associated with those who invest money in the R&D, and then how they price it. And it may include a calculation of how much R&D they put in, associated with price. It may look at outcomes. I just did something with genes. We've got a great new group in we call it Silicon Valley in Philadelphia, where I am from, and some of the remarkable new things that they are doing. One treatment can cure blindness in a child. So what's the cost associated with a lifetime of sight? How do you price that? We've got to find innovative ways to do that. But I think we need to work directly on that. And
another question. Where's our mic runner here?
Steve Knievel from Public Citizen. Congressman, thank you for giving us your time today. So Kaiser Health News polling has consistently shown that Americans across the party spectrum, Republicans, Independents, Democrats, pretty much consistent across the board, support at 92% allowing the Secretary to negotiate Part D drug prices. You clearly disagree. What would you say to the more than 9 of 10 of your constituents that think that we should allow HHS to use its negotiating power because it's the largest buyer of prescription drugs in the world?
I think I answered that. I mean, I think I answered that question earlier when it was raised. I'm not so sure. In the end, we've seen what the Veterans Administration does. We see what HHS has on its plate right now with its responsibilities to oversee the timeliness and effectiveness of getting drugs to market. Adding that whole new responsibility may or may not be a better outcome than what is currently being done, in which market-based forces are driving a lot of this down. $1.7 trillion saved. Medicare Part D far below what was expected. We're having huge outcomes on most drugs that are being delivered to people. We're looking at a segment now in which the real growth, not across the board, I know that there's incremental raising in numbers of drugs, but the real growth in drug pricing is in the innovative new delivery mechanisms, which are related back to R&D. So, this sounds good in theory, but I'm not sure creating a whole new bureaucracy is going to supplant that which is more effectively done. The plans are pretty sophisticated, and they understand the market forces more than an HHS technocrat's going to be, because I'm going to tell you the second factor. When you have somebody who's part of a private sector system and a plan and others, and they're there and they work their way through, you get government agencies. People spend 3 years, they get their chops, and then they get recruited and they leave, and a whole new group is coming in. There's constant turnover, and I don't think that there is the bandwidth to be able to do that as effectively as it's happening.
All right, another question? We got someone over here.
Julie Cantor-Weinberg with Prime Therapeutics. Thanks so much for being here. We're a PBM. I think we now have the Part D program dating all the way back to 2003. So we have so many members of Congress that weren't here then. How do we get the word out about how successful a program that's been? I think you understand that, but not enough of your colleagues do.
I think that people communicate in a lot of ways. I think that should be one of the things when you consider your advertising budgets, you factor that in. These are sophisticated issues, and I don't know that you should be relying on Congress to deliver that message per se. There's just too many things on people's plates and too many areas where people need to be focused, where they're specializing in, and they rely on others for help in these kinds of issues. But it's a good story. It should be told, because I don't think people appreciate how much progress has been made through Medicare Part D in terms of what it was anticipated to cost.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you all for your questions, for your attention. Thank you, Congressman Mann.
Thank you, Kathy.
Appreciate
Great to be with you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Now, a session on super spending produced by our underwriter, Express Scripts. Please welcome Steve Miller, Chief Medical Officer of Express Scripts.
Thank you all, and thanks to the Atlantic for hosting this event. We are pleased to underwrite this today, and it gives me my opportunity to shamelessly shill to you all. What I'd like to talk to you today about is a new report we have out just this morning on super spenders. And we define super spenders as those patients that are actually spending over $50,000 per year. We previously put out this report 2 years ago, and now we can compare over the last 2 years what has happened to this population. In the last 2 years, we now have 0.3% of the US population takes pharmaceutical products that cost $50,000. That's 870,000 people that now that have bills of over $50,000 a year for pharmaceutical products. So when you think about it, if you look around this room, you actually know, every single one of you knows one of these people that actually takes more than $50,000 worth of drugs. And why is this? It's partly because of the success of the pharmaceutical industry. We are the most innovative country in the world when it comes to drugs, and we are coming up with new therapies that are treating previously unmet medical needs. We have new oncology products for things like pulmonary artery hypertension, hereditary angioedema, diseases you've never even heard about, but often cost a huge amount of money. And so we have patients that are suffering under the bills of $50,000. And this is only going to get worse in the coming years as we have gene therapy. Because as we have more personalized medicine, it's going to shift even more drugs to be ultra expensive. And so the question is, what's happening overall? Well, it turns out that overall, the industry has actually rallied to do a good thing. 83% of you all, the vast majority of the country, spends less than $1,000 per year on their medications. And so by trying to keep the cost down for the majority of people, we're able to actually pay for these really expensive patients. Last year, drug spend for the United States went up 3.8%. For those of you who are taking just traditional oral solid drugs, diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol drugs, your expense actually went down by 0.1%. For those of you on specialty medications, your expense went up 13.3%, and when you average that together, it's 3.8%. That is actually the lowest trend we've had in a long period of time, and I can tell you preliminary data that we now have after 3 quarters of this year is that drug trend for 2017 will actually be even lower than 2016. And so we're doing a good job rallying to the occasion of trying to keep everyone's drugs prices down, even though we have these super spenders that are incredibly expensive for all of us. If you think about the number of patients spending more than $1 million, 2 years ago, 1 in a million people spent more than $1 million on pharmaceuticals. This year, it's 2 in a million people have over $1 million of spend for pharmaceuticals. And then the final issue is what's happening at the patient level. It turns out that plan sponsors, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about Medicare, Medicaid, the exchanges, or commercial plans, the amount of the money that the patient is having to spend, with rare exceptions, is actually being well controlled. If you're on a commercial plan, 98% of your pharmacy spend is covered by your insurer. That means only 2% is coming out of pocket. The average person with bills over $50,000 spent about $2,100 in copay. If you're on the other end of the spectrum and you're at Medicaid, Medicaid picked up 99.9% of the expense. Now, for these poor people, that 0.1% is still substantial, but the point is that the plan sponsors are trying to protect patients from the high cost of these medications. The final thing is, what do we got to do going forward? The biggest thing we can do policy-wise is we have to have a biosimilars market that is vigorous in the United States. If you look at what biosimilars can do for the United States, biosimilars actually could save the country over $250 billion over the next 10 years. And that pays for a lot of this personalized health care. It pays for a lot of these super spenders. So we need vigorous biosimilar policy, both from the legislation, but more importantly from the FDA. So there are certain regulations that they can have an important role in lowering the cost. I will tell you that our report is available to you all. It's at lab.express-scripts.com. I plead with you to go out and look at it. It has a tremendous amount of interesting information on this really sick population. But it's very important because it really goes with what you're hearing about today. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. It doesn't matter if you're from the pharmaceutical industry or a consumer group. We have got to work across the aisle if we're going to have logical drug policy, and we're going to keep America the most innovative country when it comes to pharmaceuticals, but we're also going to be able to afford this because this is important not just to you, it's important to your family, your neighbors, and to all of us. So thank you all for being with us. We really appreciate you coming out today.
Next up, a session on personalizing prescriptions. For that, please welcome the Colon Cancer Alliance's Chief Executive Officer, Michael Sapienza. Michael Pishvayan, Director of the Phase 1 Clinical Trial Program at Georgetown Lombardi Cancer Center. and Peter Bach, the director of the Center for Health Policy and Outcomes at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Here to lead the conversation is the Atlantic's Olga Kazan.
Okay, so we are here to talk about specialty drugs and what makes them so special. So there's this drug, and can you help me? Okay, so it's Kymriah, and tell us how to remember how to pronounce Kymriah.
I didn't come up with this. It's as if Kim Kardashian and Mariah Carey got married.
Okay.
So it's
Good.
Kymriah.
So with that image in your head, it is a CAR T.
I guess what they would name their child.
Right. Exactly. Very attractive child. So it's a CAR T drug, which is immunotherapy, right? It's a pediatric leukemia drug, and it costs nearly $500,000. So thinking about that, what does that tell us about trends in specialty drug prices? And anyone can jump in.
I think that specialty drug prices, actually, I don't know if I would use the term specialty drug because I think of that as specializing in a specific type of cancer, but the idea being a very targeted, novel, innovative agent. It definitely speaks to the fact that these things are getting more and more expensive to develop, more expensive in some cases to manufacture. This drug is definitely more expensive than most drugs to actually physically manufacture, although not $500,000. And yet represents kind of where we're going with personalized medicine in delivering these drugs in a very specialized way, not specialty way, but specialized way.
Go ahead.
No, it's it's broken the trend line, right? So we actually track cancer drug prices on our website, and we've gone up. Ignoring Kymriah's price, the price inflation on cancer drugs over the last 50 years is about 100-fold, adjusting for inflation and standardized to the month of therapy and things like that. So we've seen this, but we're in the sort of $100,000 to $150,000 range for a typical duration treatment course for cancer drugs. So this has completely broken the mold. It's $475,000 for a single treatment. Now, for many patients, we think they will only get a single treatment, but compared to, if you will, a duration of these other treatments of being about $100,000, it's completely out of range.
And for those of us who don't know, walk us through why drugs like that are so much more expensive than, say, like a metformin or just Lipitor, something that lots and lots of people would take.
Well, specialty drug prices and pharmaceutical corporations can price drugs essentially in cancer however they choose to. People will say there's a competitive market for drugs, but it's certainly not the case for cancer. Medicare and Medicaid are required to pay for every cancer drug that the FDA approves at whatever price the manufacturer charges, although Medicaid has some statutory discounts. Most plans in most states that are regulated by states are required to cover every cancer drug as well. And there's tremendous political pressure as well to cover cancer drugs. And so once you have everyone in the system required to buy a drug, then there's no ability to drive down prices, essentially. And so we shouldn't be surprised. Essentially, the only check in the system is sort of what the market will tolerate in terms of bad headlines. And so so every single story about Kymriah included the price tag, so that's a bad headline, but there it is at $475,000.
Right, but right after the paragraph where they say the price, you have the quote from a pharmaceutical executive or whoever else saying, well, we have to price it this high because of innovation and R&D. What do you guys all make of that argument? The R&D drives these high prices.
So Olga, I just wanted to touch on first the beginning piece, which is, from a patient perspective, Kymriah, although it's not in the colorectal cancer space yet, I would argue that most patients, Dr. John Marshall from Georgetown, who works with Mike really closely, would say, any patient or family would take out a credit card and pay for those drugs no matter what the cost was. And then Peter came in and said, oh, well, most people don't have that type of credit limit. So I think that piece is a really important piece to understand in the context of this conversation, that yes, there are a lot of players in the patient perspective and the caregiver perspective and the family perspective of that innovation. We want that to happen faster, not slower. So I think just in the context of this whole conversation, it's important.
I'll mention a couple things about research and innovation. There is a lot of room to grow and to improve upon in the development of drugs for patients with bad cancers. I work primarily in GI cancers, treating patients with pancreatic cancer. There's a tremendous room for growth in that disease, which still kills most people that come up with that kind of cancer. And so, we're all for very aggressive, very innovative, very novel ways to try and attack these different types of cancers. And doing the core research, the basic research, the preclinical research, and then developing well-designed clinical trials that ultimately bring a drug to approval is really, really important. I don't know that it really costs the amount that the drug companies are charging for it. I think Peter shared some nice data backstage that there's data to suggest that it does not cost as much as is being charged for it. But at the same time, the pharmaceutical companies are driving a lot of research because government NIH funding is actually going down significantly. So we as researchers are caught in a little bit of a bind. And I wanted to make one other comment about Kymriah and a lot of the other immunotherapy drugs. They are more expensive to manufacture, so the companies get a little bit of a pass for that. But you're also breaking another barrier with some of these drugs where actually you're talking about potential cures. And in an advanced, incurable cancer, to have drugs that might actually allow a patient to lead an otherwise normal, healthy life, that's, how do you price that? How do you really, if you're curing a pediatric ALL patient and allowing them to lead out a normal life, it's really hard to put a limit on that price. So you have to take that into consideration as well.
Right. But I feel like, usually when we talk about these prices, the comparison is always what do they cost in Europe, and then how did Europe get a cheaper price usually? So can you talk about, are these drugs available in other countries, and then how is the pricing determined there?
So I don't think in the case of this drug it's available yet in Europe. The early indication from China is that the price will be about $70,000. So is what I've read at least. But generally European prices are for specialty drugs are a half or a third of what they are. And the thing you were mentioning, we had a piece of research in Health Affairs where we actually priced the total additional money the pharma sector is getting from charging higher U.S. prices than Europe, and compared it to their global R&D budget, research and development budgets, and it was almost twice. It was 1.7 times, just in charging U.S. patients more compared to what they spend globally on research. So there's plenty of premium in there above, if you will, the European reserve price. Now, generally people will say, well, that's, you can't compare to Europe because they are, whatever, communists or something like that, or I don't know, progressives or something horrible. And the challenge with that is an ideological frame that focuses more on the actor than the action. So Express Scripts is here, right? So Express Scripts has 80 million covered lives or something like that. I don't have the exact number, 84, something like that, 84.13 million covered lives, but I'm not sure. And Ireland is a nation of about 4 million people. And so Express Scripts can use their market leverage to obtain lower prices, and we all think that's great. But when Ireland acts with 1/20th the population to obtain lower prices, we call it socialism. So it's all about the actor, not the action. Companies are not forced to sell into Ireland. Of course, they prefer to because many of them manufacture there because of the tax benefits of doing so. But these are just market actors that do better than we do.
So it's their kind of government insurance. I know Europe has a million different ways of doing this, but say like the sickness funds in Germany will negotiate actually a lower price for drugs.
Yes, Germany's a complex marketplace, but yes, the average prices that are paid in the German sickness funds are considerably lower. A guess number would be a half to a third for most branded specialty drugs.
Okay, so this is where we get into value-based pricing. So maybe you can tell us about that and about drug through the lens of Drug Abacus and what that is.
Yeah, so I developed this thought experiment, or website, if you will, for exploring different ways of pricing drugs. The basic market failure we have here is actually probably not that we're spending too much on drugs, but that we're allocating dollars in kind of a stupid way. And these failures are a product of things like laws that make you buy a drug no matter how much it costs. So instead, the theory is the market failure is because of lack of transparency and things like that. We should just assign prices to drugs that are based on how well the drugs work. And what the Drug Abacus does is it allows sort of users to explore what would happen if I paid for a drug a lot because it treated a rare disease. Well, that makes some prices go up and others go down. What if I paid a lot for life extension, for this sort of, taking a kid and giving them, Emily Whitehead is the patient always mentioned for the CAR T therapies and, decades of life. and I want to pay more for that. And then you start to realize what the trade-offs we're making are. By paying a lot for orphan diseases and rare diseases, we move money to those areas. They have to either come away from other areas, or we have to just keep paying more and more for drugs. But the idea of the drug abacus is to put that all into a frame, and the things you see from it immediately are there are trade-offs, but more importantly, there's a way to do this. There's math here. We could price drugs this way. Our challenges are inertia and ideology. They're not mathematical and they're not scientific.
So I want to get into that math a little bit more, but I am wondering, I mean, from a patient perspective, like just even the thought, you know, this drug is available, but it's too expensive. We don't know if it's worth giving it to you. Talk about, I mean, you guys work with patients who are really in dire straits. What are some of the, you know, what are some of the things that patients say to you, or what are some of the concerns that they have about, I mean, you mentioned that you only work mostly with patients who have 6 months to live, so a drug that, you know, extends your life by 6 months is good, you know?
I'll take the physician's perspective first. Yeah, I think that we are trying to develop some understanding of what really is of value to a patient, and I think value is definitely proportional. For a disease that only most patients only live 6 months, to get to 8.5 months is actually a big change. There are things that we can measure and test that can go along with that. For example, in pancreatic cancer, there were studies that looked at quality of life in parallel to extension of life, and it's very important that some of the new therapies we have for pancreatic cancer actually improve the quality of life as well as extend survival. So those are important measures. But you know, when you have a disease that you don't have anything to give, to be able to move the bar a little bit is really important. Now, on the other hand, I also treat patients with advanced colon cancer, and we have pretty good therapies even in the advanced disease. And the last couple of drugs that have been approved in the last 5 years or so have only very marginally moved the bar on that. And actually, coincidentally, they tend to be very expensive drugs. And there is a very legitimate discussion as to whether it's quote unquote worth the cost of those drugs, even to patients, because at least one of those drugs is actually has a fair number of side effects that patients have to tolerate as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with most of what Mike said. I think from a patient perspective, it's time. And as we were saying earlier with Kim Ryan, it could potentially be a cure. So time meaning how much longer do I have with my family, right? Mm-hmm. How much longer can they potentially live? I do think the quality of life piece is a really important thing that we don't include in value enough. So in my previous life, I was a professional musician. I was a trumpet player. And a lot of the treatments that we have may cause side effects, right? So when we're talking about value-based pricing, et cetera, sometimes we often talk about the price. We don't include quality of life. So some of the therapies would cause neuropathy in my hands, and I would have no job, right? I would not be able to do my job. And so I think that's a really, really important piece, both obviously the time in which we may have left with our families, but what does that mean if I can't work, or if the side effects are so harsh that it's just unsustainable.
There's one other filter to have this discussion around, and I'm sure Peter and Michael knew this data as well. There was a very nice study in lung cancer that demonstrated that actually if we just supported patients more, gave them palliative care, not end-of-life care, but supportive care, that they actually lived longer and with a better quality of life. And that cost very, very little. It was not a drug per se. And so that's another metric that we should be comparing some of these drugs to as well.
So since, I mean, to be approved by the FDA, you don't have to necessarily be effective, right? You just have to be safe.
No.
No, you have to be
safe and effective.
Safe and effective, but you don't have to be more effective than the last thing, right?
So in the cancer drug space, you should be more effective than standard of care, but many of the approvals nowadays don't involve such a comparison. Mm-hmm. And so it's, if you will, inferential. So you'll give a drug, just a bunch of patients will get the drug, they'll respond. Kymriah's approval had no comparator arm. And then you will look at the data from that trial, which tends to be a highly select group of patients, mm-hmm. and ask, okay, well, does this look better than kind of what we know standard of care is? And I forget the number right now, but I think it's the preponderance of approvals now in cancer and some of these other diseases mm-hmm. that are uncontrolled. In areas like multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, there tend to be comparator groups. And we're not just talking about cancer, obviously, today. But this is a serious concern,
right?
Because when you have to talk to a patient about how well a drug works, you can say, well, this is what happened to the people in the trial. And then if somebody asks about, well, what about this older, cheaper drug, we say, well, we don't have a way to really tell you, for an extra $100,000, how much better you will do. We just know that we can give that to you.
Right. And so do hospitals or doctors ever not offer kind of the latest and most expensive treatment to patients because it seems like it won't make much of a difference?
Not usually. I mean, if there is a proven drug that the FDA has approved and it's part of the standard algorithm for patients, it's hard to say, don't bother, it's not worth it. There are some drugs that have a lot of side effects, and you have a discussion as to whether you really want to subject yourself to that degree of side effects, but it's definitely not, it's not taken off the table at the outset, just because of cost.
So bearing all that in mind, what does the math look like? I mean, what should you do if you notice that, there are these trade-offs and, like you're looking at the drug abacus, you've set all your dials to your kind of mindset. What's the conclusion that you should come to?
Well, we need a different system for paying for drugs. And, a drug like Kymriah, a group in Boston called ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, is doing a review of Kymriah and the CAR-T, that's a category it falls into, drugs, which I think is coming out early next year. And I think we'll get a better sense of that price relative to the benefits. Because as Michael points out, there's a very small subsegment of patients who may actually have a long-term benefit. I hesitate to use the word cure. I think it can be misleading to patients. But there's obviously a lot of toxicity there as well. But I think the implication is, every other Western country uses formal technology assessment to figure out how much they want to pay for things, whether they're medical devices or drugs. We don't. And in fact, drugs are essentially the only important sector in healthcare today where the monopolist sets the price. We pay everybody else on combination negotiated rates and fee schedules. So Medicare pays, sort of cost plus, or there's this magical formula for how much they pay for my services called the resource-based relative value scale, but it has nothing to do with my monopoly power. I can sign up for Medicare and then they just look up this schedule and they pay me based on my merit, which is very low, so they've obviously gauged me appropriately.
And so what about Medicaid, though? I mean, I read reports that, for Medicaid, it's a very different picture because it's not, for Sovaldi, for example, you have to wait until you're in late stage, late stages of the disease. Does it look different depending on what kind of insurance the patient has?
Can you remind us what Sovaldi is? We were talking about trade names.
Oh, that's the Hep C drug?
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is the first generation Hep C drug.
Yeah.
So my perspective is, and this is something Peter probably knows very, very well, is this concept of value-based care. So we're not just, in oncology especially, we talk about extension of survival and or increased cure rate. And that's just really one metric, but that's the metric that the FDA usually approves a drug on. And we think that a lot of the approvals should be linked to cost and in a term really that's about value. So extension of life, plus what it means to the patient sort of in their particular stage of cancer, plus the side effects that come with that drug or those classes of drugs. And that whole concept together should be of value. The Hep C drugs, again, I would argue, have great value because this is a disease that was leading to liver cancer for many patients that we had no treatment for, and now all of a sudden patients are being cured, truly cured, of this virus. So there's tremendous value in this disease, and I think that's why it's priced so high.
Yeah, one thing I was just going to say, going back to what you were saying, Peter, about the immunotherapy. One of the things we're kind of, and obviously this is just the cancer space, so I want to be careful, but, one of the things we're kind of fighting with is how much of the cost of Kymriah, and I'm just using that as an example, right, is influenced by the quote-unquote hype around the word cure for immunotherapy. So within colorectal cancer, only about 5 to 7% of patients are going to have, overall, benefit. So what about the other 95%, right? And I just look at how does that, kind of come into the formula for that. And then the other piece I was just touching on, we talked about this backstage a little bit, is the copay. So, where I said earlier any patient would take out a credit card and kind of pay for whatever they wanted, I do think with some of these specialty drugs, the copays are starting to come into play, especially with the nervousness around all the different types of things that are happening in the health insurance market.
Yeah. And I'm going to take questions in a second from the audience, but just really quick for you, you had an interesting idea of how pharma can actually bring down maybe their advertising costs by working with patient advocacy groups. Can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, and I don't want to use specific examples, but let's say any pharma drug comes to market. You know, we're spending about $200 to $250 billion on direct-to-consumer advertising, which, you know, whether and let's take these specialty drugs, you're really not targeting that specialty population or that personalized population. Whereas, let's say you could take, you know, I don't know, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million and actually target a specific patient population, like the colorectal cancer population or the pancreatic cancer population. So use some of that money. I would think that we get a much better bang for our buck in terms of not having to spend $250 million or $500 million on that part of the R&D process.
Yeah, actually, so Joe Ross at Yale has a very interesting study which told me how to interpret direct-to-consumer advertising. The amount of money spent on advertising is inversely proportional to the benefit of the drug. And so if you see a drug ad, it means that the evidence hasn't convinced doctors in and of itself. Right? So things like the Hep C treatments, they are heavily advertised because of the screening, so it's an outlier, if you will. But most of these things are on the margin, just they're trying to try a patient channel because they haven't been able to convince doctors through conventional channels. And so that's a good guide, if you will. I'm not sure that stat on spending is right, but it's certainly a considerable amount. We and one other country, I can't remember which other country, even allowed DTC advertising. Sorry?
I think New Zealand.
New Zealand, thank you. But it's an outlier. On the Hep C front, you asked about Medicaid, not to promote our own work, but on the Drug Pricing Lab website, which is my research group's website, you can actually go on and try and figure out how the state of Louisiana is supposed to pay for Hep C. Because we're told it's a huge value, but you can actually go and try and reallocate their budget and figure out, you know, how many nurses you'd like to fire and how much K through 12 education you'd like to stop to pay for Hep C treatment. People say it's priced based on its value, but value is dictated also by the buyer. And Louisiana has a severe budgetary problem. They have something like 70,000 people that they could treat for Hep C, including about 20,000 in prisons, that they cannot afford to treat, even though on the margin producing this treatment is cheap.
Yeah.
And so I want rewards to go where they should, and you know the rewards to the company that invented this, a company called Pharmasset, were accrued by the shareholders when Gilead bought them, and then Gilead added on more prices compared to what even Pharmasset was going to charge, and now people can't afford it. There's about 2.7 million people in this country untreated for hepatitis C. We've treated about 600,000. We've had treatment since 2013. It is almost entirely due to the price of the drug.
On that happy note, anyone have any questions?
Hi, my name is Samuel Pandya. I work at Pharma. My question is for Dr. Bach. I was looking at a report by Magellan Health that came out back in April. I think they've done it for several years, where they track about 20 medicines and the amount of hospital markups that are on those particular medicines. There are multiple fold markups above their acquisition cost to the point where the hospital is making more money on those medicines than the manufacturer is. Do you agree with such practices? And if you don't agree with them, what, if anything, have you done to see to it that the hospital where you work stops engaging in such practices?
It's a very fair question. We have a problematic system generally, and there are markups throughout, if you will, the supply and payment chain. So middlemen not only add up, you know, wholesalers not only add on prices, but they also play price futures. And, you know, PBMs also take pieces. They will tell you they save money in the aggregate, but there are obviously anecdotal cases where patients are being encouraged to buy drugs that are more expensive for some reason out of pocket, even when there are cheaper substitutes. And hospital markups, our group has written a lot, if you can go right back to our website and look at these markups that you're describing. Those markups are largest in hospitals that obtain these discounts through 340B. My institution doesn't happen to be one of them. But in general, I think hospital-based and doctor-based markups are highly distorting incentives. And you know, I think our group has been very consistent showing research on that. The ambient markup on medical benefit drugs is about 52% in our system. So across all hospitals and doctors, which means a vial of $10,000 colon cancer drug turns into a $15,000 drug by the time a patient receives it, paid between the insurance and their co-insurance. And so it is a serious added burden, if you will, or friction in the system. Which I think is probably inefficient, but far more worse than the inefficiency is it's aligned towards higher prices. And so a $10,000 drug a hospital make $5,000 on, or the system, hospitals and doctors. A $2,000 drug, they make much less. And so this is one of the reasons, sadly, that when we get new expensive drugs in cancer, they get used. Because doctors make more money when they use the expensive drug than the cheap drug. Hospitals do the same. So a drug like Abraxane, which is basically paclitaxel, but super expensive instead of super cheap, is far more used, particularly by community doctors, than essentially generic Abraxane, which is paclitaxel, because of the added profits they can make.
I think one more question. Yeah.
I'm Tom Gustafson from Arnold & Porter, and I would be interested in any of the panelists' thoughts, recommendations, or suggestions in a coordinate area. I assume you would all agree that improved diagnostics would be a great idea for personalized medicine. It sort of almost goes without saying. But how do we get there? Do you have any thoughts, recommendations about what can be done, what we can do as a society to improve the availability of diagnostics that will help us target personalized medicine?
So I'll take that on, and for disclosure, I do spend part of my time as chief medical officer of a diagnostics company. But I live in that space because I actually believe in that space of personalized medicine, and I think that at least in cancer care, there are a small percentage of patients, it's probably about, depending upon the cancer type, somewhere between 5 and 25% of patients. If we had the full set of molecular testing of their tumor, we would know how better to treat them. And we know that this is true through studies that have been done, in some cases controlled studies, in some cases just anecdotal studies of large numbers of patients. And the fact that we can't get the system to approve a $5,800 test and we just use a $15,000 drug without even thinking twice about it, I think is kind of crazy. I think if we had the capacity to test more patients, we could treat more patients in a much more specific way with a greater degree of benefit for those who really needed it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's our time. Thank you so much, Michael, and Peter. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Olga, and as she said, Peter and both Michaels. Thanks so much to our speakers and moderators this morning. Today's topic is endlessly fascinating and enormously complicated, and no matter where we sit in the world, it obviously touches our lives in a meaningful way. And beyond specialty drugs like Kymriah, I'm trying to get that, I will never hear that name without thinking of Kim Kardashian and Mariah Carey and the beautiful baby that they're going to have. But beyond that, we did talk, and beyond the high cost of prescription drugs, we covered a lot of important territory. Breakthrough treatments, the high cost of drug development, R&D, how the U.S. is funding the world, super users, the need for competition, for transparency. We talked about a value-based approach, generics and biosimilars, and about quality of life and the importance of time. Well, in this conversation, there is clearly a tremendous amount of tension and wide-ranging views. I do want to say that I'm enormously pleased that we had such a robust conversation, and I promise you that this is a topic and a set of issues that we want to continue covering and talking about. Thank you to our Underwriter Express Scripts for making this morning possible. Mostly, I'd like to thank all of you in the audience. We know how valuable your time is, and so we're enormously grateful that you spent so much of it with us this morning. One last request before you depart, which is that on your chairs and in your email, you will have a quick survey from me asking for your feedback. And honestly, your feedback for this kind of forum is enormously important to us and helps us define our work and make it better each and every time. So if you would take a few minutes to just fill that out, we would be so grateful. Thank you all for a wonderful morning, and enjoy the rest of this beautiful fall day.